July 2025 brought firmware updates for almost every current production Canon hybrid and cinema camera. For many of these cameras, the changelogs was quite short. A handful of fixes and a new security update that added a logon password. For the R5, Canon included a handful of additional updates as well. 9 changes in total are listed in the changelog. We're going to start our tour of the new updates features with a look at the new system password function. This is intended to comply with an EU directive for network-attached devices, and its intent is to protect personal identifiable information and network security settings on your device, not the pictures or anything like that. Upon rebooting after performing the firmware update, you'll be required to set a 6-digit numeric password before you can continue using your camera. Now, by default, this password will be required every time the camera is powered on or wakes up from sleep, unless this password request function is disabled. Now, unfortunately, given how poorly designed the prompt is, you're almost certainly going to want to do that. Once you've completed the initial setup, power cycling the camera will present you with this logon prompt. Touch the text box or press Set to open the password entrance interface, which is basically just a numpad where you'll enter your password. You can use either the touch interface or the quick control dials and multi-controller to enter your password. Once you've entered your password, select OK, and then select OK a second time from the login screen to continue and access the camera. If the wrong password is entered 10 times, the camera will block access for a period of time. Canon, I believe, says it's 10 minutes, before you can continue to try again. You can also just power cycle the camera and immediately try again for another 10 attempts. You'll also notice a Do Not Ask Again checkbox on this login screen. Checking this is one of 2 ways to disable this login password prompt. The other is through the camera's menus, which I will cover in a moment. Now, I would also recommend at this point that you write down your password and keep it somewhere safe. While you can disable the boot up prompt that requires a password every time you turn the camera on, you cannot completely disable, clear, or remove the password from your camera. If you forget your password and the login prompt is reactivated, say inadvertently somehow or by a future firmware update, you will not be able to access the camera without your password, or alternatively, without clearing all of the camera's settings and resetting up your camera from scratch. In addition to the login prompt, this new feature adds 2 related menus. First is the Manage Password menu on page 4 of the yellow menu setup menu section. There you will find 3 entries: password request, change password, and clear entered information. The strangely abbreviated P-word or password request function is where you go to enable or disable that boot password prompt through the menu system. You'll also need to enter your password when selecting this before you can change the setting. Next is Change Password. Selecting this is where you change your password, and this will guide you through a standard password change procedure. That is, you'll need to enter your old password, a new password, and then repeat the new password a second time to verify that it's correct. Finally, last is the Clear Entered Information setting. As best as I can tell, this just performs a standard factory reset on the camera, the same as the Reset Camera entry does on page 5 of the same setup menu section. Now, the other new menu that's part of this update is an access log of certain system changes. You'll find this under the Show Log function on page 6 of the yellow setup menu section. The log contains the type of change and the timestamp for when that change was made, and it will log changes to the password section, system, network connections, and, according to the manual, other camera settings. Though, so far, I've only seen password and network settings show up in the log. Now, unfortunately, we're talking about a camera here, and that means it has a limited amount of non-volatile storage for things like this log. Unfortunately, on top of that, Canon provides no information on the size of the log, how the camera handles the log when it reaches its maximum size, or a way to clear the log. This also could potentially mean problems in the future for firmware updates because now the camera has to use some of what used to be the NVRAM for the firmware to have this log. So there's less room for adding new features potentially in future firmware updates. Finally, the camera's password is not saved when you save your camera settings to a file or transfer them through that file to another camera. Now, in any event, while this setting or update or feature may address the letter of the EU technical directive, the problem here really boils down to the implementation, and that does render this system almost unusable in my opinion. Either you're going to miss all the shots you wanted while you're fumbling with the password entry screen to unlock your camera, or you're going to end up turning it off and or turning off the auto power on if you want to use it, and then running your batteries dead because you won't have sleep mode enabled so your camera is ready to use when you need it. Of course, you could also turn the system off or the prompt off, which is what I think most of us will do. At a minimum, Canon needs to redesign the boot prompt to work more like the prompt on any smartphone. I think they also need to add a auto lock timeout setting that is independent from the auto power off time so that you can set the camera to use a short auto power off time to save battery life, but not have to enter your password every minute after the camera goes to sleep while you're in the middle of a shoot. Additionally, for the more security-minded and really just for the sake of completeness, I think there really should be an option to factory reset the camera after 10 failed attempts instead of just locking it. I personally think this is a completely overkill thing to do, but at least it takes the intent of the function to its logical conclusion and protects the data that's on the camera for network settings. So with the big new security feature out of the way, Canon also added 2 new network-related features to the camera. First is the ability to perform online firmware updates directly from the camera. No phone or computer necessary, just a network connection. Now, truth be told, I have mixed feelings about this one. On one hand, it's hard to argue against the convenience of being able to just update your camera from itself. On the other hand, from what I've been able to gather so far, and again, there is very little information clearly describing how this function works and how to use it, at least in the manual, doing this seems to require an account with Canon's image.canon service and the camera to be connected to it. At least, I haven't been able to find a way in trying to test this to see if the firmware is up to date with the camera connected over my network to either Canon's EOS utility on my computer or an FTP server on my network, so it isn't just a network thing and it goes and checks. Now, in any event, I'm not going to tell anyone not to use this function. But with that said, I want to reiterate that there is always a risk associated with updating your camera's firmware, regardless of what process you use. Personally, I don't find using a card to be all that onerous of a process, and additionally, I'm becoming more and more conservative about updates and not applying them immediately as they appear. So, for me personally, at least, I'm going to keep doing the old card routine and waiting a couple weeks to a month after a firmware is released, at least until I have both a better understanding of and more confidence in this in-camera update process. If it proves to be reliable, though, it would be nice to have. The other network-related update is an addition to support Canon's Software Development Assistance Kit. Now, exactly what this is, I'm not actually sure. I've looked through the documentation on Canon USA's developer site, and I can't find any information on it, or at least not yet. Maybe there's stuff that just hasn't been published yet. What it didn't do, at least on my camera, is enable Canon's network-based camera control API, which is an optional thing on the R5. Now, moving on from the network-related functions, we come to the new combined rate and protect functionality that's also been added in this update. So with this firmware, the camera can be configured now to protect pictures automatically as they're rated. The functionality is enabled through the Protect when setting the rating setting found on page 1 of the blue playback menu. In addition to enabling or disabling this function, you can also specify what ratings will include protection. To set this up, enter the Protect when setting the rating menu page and then press Info, either the physical button on the camera or the on-screen virtual button. Then select the ratings you want the protection settings to apply to. With this, you can, for example, protect only 4- and 5-star images without protecting the 1-, 2-, and 3-star ones, or whatever you choose. Now that said, remember, protection only prevents the image from being deleted on the camera. It doesn't transfer to your computer in any meaningful way, and it won't stop the images from being deleted if you choose to format the card. This firmware also includes partial support for CFExpress cards larger than 8 terabytes. Now I say partial support here because to use these cards, they have to be low-level formatted in the camera. The format process will create an 8 terabyte partition on the card and format that, in effect limiting the card to only 8 terabytes. Additionally, cards larger than 2 terabytes cannot be used for firmware updates. Now, with that said, a quick search of B&H's current inventory for CFExpress cards shows that the largest cards currently on offer are only 4 terabytes. So we are getting close to having 8 terabyte potentially larger cards, but we're not there yet. Now, on the whole thing of using 8 terabyte cards in your camera, personally, that sounds like a big case of or an awful lot like putting a lot of your eggs in one basket. Especially when even a 4 terabyte card is good for more than 3 hours of 8K raw recording, and I don't even want to know how many pictures you can put on it. Canon has also added support for peripheral coordinated control image stabilization in photo mode for the RF 16 to 28mm f2.8 IS STM lens. Now, Canon has another lens that supports PCC-IS. It's the RF 10 to 20mm f4L IS STM. And that lens was included in the R5 Mark II's update notes for the comparable update, but it's not listed in the R5's release notes. Moreover, Canon doesn't have the same supplemental information for the R5 as they do with the Mark II on the cam.start.canon site, so I'm not sure if that lens is supported or not. Finally, wrapping up the firmware update are 3 bug fixes for code 70 errors. These are coming up or fixing situations where Bluetooth communication is interfered with in a high radio noise environment, when high-speed shooting in continuous plus is used, and an issue with the HDMI output momentarily stopping when the screen turn off or the screen off function is activated through the camera's power saving settings. So that's what's in this update, and let me wrap this video up with a couple of quick thoughts. First, it's really nice to see that Canon is continuing to provide updates to their older cameras, not just the R5, instead of abandoning them. This is especially true for the R5 since, well, the Mark II is out, and Canon has a long history of kind of being like, well, the new camera's out, the old one just doesn't matter anymore. The reality, though, is that the R5 is still an incredibly solid camera, and in certain specific niche cases, maybe arguably even better than the R5 Mark II due to slightly higher dynamic range with the electronic first curtain and mechanical shutters. So updates for the camera, especially for new lenses, is something that I think is really important for Canon to continue doing, and something I absolutely applaud Canon for doing in this case. Now that said, the new password system is well-intentioned as it is, and I get the whole complying with laws in the EU and global business and all of that, is still an absolute usability disaster. Now, I'm sure at this point in time, it's 2025 after all, that Canon's engineers have smartphones and could easily have looked at how Apple or Google or Samsung implements passcode locks on their phones to do this right. Moreover, anybody who works in the InfoSec field or has ever dealt with computer security knows that security doesn't work when the process is so cumbersome that it's easier to just turn it off and not use it. Personally, though, I would rather Canon focus their obviously limited development resources on new photographic features. I have been championing for ages frame averaging for long exposure landscape photography, but there's tons of other things that would be relatively simple to add or improve that would make Canon's cameras, and by extension our lives as photographers, better instead of half-baked implementations of things that just make our lives harder. That said, I hope you found this useful or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.